But whatever the reasons one might conjure up in retrospect, the result of the manoeuvring up to this moment was that the Battle of the Philippine Sea was joined when that big blip came in on the radar screens at 1000 hours on June 19th. The Americans were on the defensive. The Japanese had their position and had launched the first punch. Wave after wave of Japanese planes headed toward the American fleet, and plane after plane was shot down by Mitch's fighters. Or, if they escaped the American fighters, because there were so many melees in the air, the anti-aircraft guns of the fleet splashed them into the sea. Attacks were pressed home on Reeves's and Montgomery's task groups and on the battleship group, but the only ship that got a direct hit from a bomb was the South Dakota. Minneapolis, Wasp, and Bunker Hill were damaged by near misses, but not enough to interfere seriously with their competence. Admiral Ozawa sent out 4 strikes between 1,000 and 1,500 hours. They were simply decimated by the highly organized American carrier air force. In the first raid, the Japanese sent 69 planes, and 42 did not return to their carriers. In the second, they launched 128 planes, and 97 disappeared. The third strike was more fortunate. 40 of 47 planes returned to their carriers, but most of them did not find the Americans. The fourth raid consisted of 82 planes, and 73 of these were shot down or put out of action on land airstrips. The Japanese attacks failed because of superior American air organization, superior American planes, and superior American pilots. Take the last as an indicator. The American pilots had 2 years training and at least 300 hours flying time. The Japanese pilots at this time, most of them, had between 6 months and 2 months training. The attrition of the carriers and of the land-based airstrikes against the Japanese-held islands had shown its effectiveness this day. As for the planes, they were the result of the careful attention to detail and fighting needs by Admiral Towers, Admiral McCain, Admiral Radford, and the other officers who had served in the Bureau of Aeronautics, where the responsibility lay. As for organization, the secret was in communications and the way they were used. The fighter directors sent the planes where they were needed when they were needed. The result was so one-sided a battle that the encounter has become known in history as the Marianas Turkey Shoot. Some 400 Japanese planes from carriers and the islands were put out of action, while the Americans lost about 30 to enemy fire and the accidents of operations. In the afternoon, the submarine Kavala reported that she torpedoed a Japanese carrier of the Shokaku class. It was Shokaku. Shortly afterward, Albacore torpedoed the carrier Taiho. Both sank, but in the confusion of battle, Spruance did not know that either was sunk, or that more than one had been hit. The task force was too far away from the enemy to do anything about it at the moment anyhow. All day long the carriers had been heading into the wind to launch and recover planes, then back westward when they might, to close the distance on the enemy. But late afternoon found Task Force 58 only about 40 miles from Guam. In the evening, Spruance detached Harrell's groups to refuel, making strikes on Guam and Rota on their way to the rendezvous. Spruance also sent a night message to Mitcher. Desire to attack enemy tomorrow if we know his position with sufficient accuracy. If our patrol planes give us required information tonight, no searches should be necessary. If not, we must continue searches tomorrow to ensure adequate protection for Saipan. Point option should be advanced to the westward as much as air operations permit. But again, the searches were not forthcoming from the carriers, although Mitcher had the 24 night fighters, which could have covered every sector out to 400 miles. See Morrison, Volpez's 8, p. 285. Ozawa might have been found by a night search, and if so, he could have been attacked at dawn. It is not to fault Mitcher, or Spruance either. Morrison indicated that Mitcher was concerned about his pilots and not confident of night fighter operations. But if at this time the American problem was lack of information, it was the same for the Japanese. Admiral Ozawa had lost 2 carriers, which Spruance did not know, but Ozawa did. But he had also lost nearly all the planes he had sent out, which Ozawa did not know, but Spruance did. Radio Tokyo was claiming 11 American carriers sunk, and the pilots who did get back from the Turkey Shoot claimed to have downed hundreds of American planes. Ozawa was ready to refuel and rejoin the battle next day. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz was unhappy. Not upset, not distressed, not lacking in confidence of his fleet commander, but unhappy. He sat down late on June 19th to let Spruance know exactly how he felt. "We are following with the closest interest your operations around the Marianas, and we share with you a feeling which I know you must have, that of frustration in our failure to bring our carrier superiority to bear on the Japanese fleet during the last few days. We all understand, of course, that the Japanese had better information of our whereabouts through their shore-based long-range search than we had of their locations. It was exasperating to have one of the early reports of the first long-range search conducted from Saipan be delayed 8 hours in reaching you. Whether or not the situation would have been different had this delay not occurred is of course problematical. It now appears that the Japanese fleet is retiring for replenishment, and that following a short period for this purpose we may have another chance at it. If they come back, I hope you will be able to bring them into action." Spruance was in touch with Mitscher that morning of June 20th. Damaged Zuikaku may still be afloat. If so, believe she will be most likely heading northwest. Desire to push our searches today as far westward as possible. If no contacts with the enemy fleet result, consider it an indication fleet is withdrawing, and further pursuit after today will be unprofitable. If you concur, retire tonight towards Saipan. We'll order out tankers of Task Group 58.4 and direct Task Group 58.4 to remain in the vicinity of Saipan. Zuikaku must be sunk if we can reach her. It was not until the middle of the afternoon that a search plane found the Japanese fleet, apparently heading toward Okinawa or Japan, Spruance believed. Ozawa had been planning to fuel, but when the Americans were sighted coming toward him, the refueling was cancelled. Ozawa still planned to strike the next day, until he discovered in a check on the fleet how serious the plane losses had been. If Mitscher's search planes had been out in the morning, they would perhaps have found the Japanese, and the strikes could have begun early. As it was, the planes did not begin launching until after 1600 hours. The planes had a long flight, about 350 miles, and by the time they arrived over the Japanese fleet at 1840, they had little fuel and little time. The report at the time was that one Hitaka-class carrier was sunk, one damaged and burning, one Shokaku-class carrier took 3 or 4 1,000-pound bomb hits, a light carrier was hit at least once, a battleship of the Congo class was hit, a heavy cruiser was damaged, a destroyer was sunk and 2 damaged, and 3 oilers sunk and 2 burning, and 15 or 20 planes were shot down. Actually, 2 oilers went first. Then the carrier Hiyo was torpedoed and sunk. Zuikaku was hit but managed to reach port. The carrier Chiyoda's flight deck was wrecked. The battleship Haruna was damaged. But by nightfall the Japanese had lost another 65 planes, and of the 430 on the decks of the carriers a day earlier, only 35 were left. As the carrier planes from the American task force headed home, darkness fell. Jocko Clark takes credit for having been the one to suggest that the carrier lights be turned on. Mitscher ordered the whole force to light up, and Spruance agreed. 20 planes were lost that day in operations against the enemy, 80 in the confusions of the night recovery, but only 16 pilots and 33 crewmen failed to come back. So for practical purposes, the battle was over. Questions were later raised. Mitscher, it is said, asked Spruance to release Ching Li's battleships to make a stern chase against the Japanese, and Spruance refused to do so. Next morning the searches began again, but nothing was found. When nothing was found on June 22nd either, the battle was at an end. At Pearl Harbor there were daily meetings of the Kibitzers Club. Halsey was there. He, Towers, Calhoun, and others sat around reading the messages and talking. In the beginning, Towers was furious. "I told them not to send him out there," he complained to General Levy, the Army logistics man, after the second day of the operation. But then, after the Marianas turkey shoot, when it was obvious that Spruance was seeking out the enemy, Towers' view changed. "I was wrong," he said. "Spruance is a great man." The carrier task group commanders were uniform in their unhappiness that the enemy had gotten away, and they believed it was the great chance missed. At Pearl, Nimitz was calm. If the tension grew strong, he would go out beside the building to his little shooting gallery and go after the targets with his .22 pistol. Captain Anderson, the fleet medical officer who had replaced Captain Gendreau, had dreamed up the shooting gallery on the principle that target shooting takes total concentration, and Nimitz could not worry while he was squeezing that trigger. It seemed to work in more than one way. The newspaper correspondents, seeing Nimitz on his shooting range, would jump to the happy, if erroneous, conclusion that everything must be fine if the old man could play with his pop guns. So the Battle of the Philippine Sea ended in anticlimax, because so many had expected so much. Yet the fact was that it was a fair victory by any standards. 3 of the Japanese carriers were sunk, and 2 were very badly damaged. Never again would Japanese carrier-based air power play a decisive role in the Pacific War. Spruance really had very little time to consider whether or not he was disappointed. He still carried too much responsibility. The fighting was going very slowly on Saipan. The invasion of Guam had been delayed by the Turkey shoot, and the invasion of Tinian had still to be accomplished. His primary mission was to take the Marianas, and he turned back to it. But he did sum up his views on the fleet action in a letter to Nimitz a few days later. To go back to ancient history now, the sortie of the Japanese fleet. To begin with, as you know, I doubted if they would come out after us, particularly in view of their failure to support Biak, where they had a great superiority. When they did leave the Philippines, I thought that my estimate of their strategical attitude had been all wrong, and that they had decided to risk everything in a determined attack on us while we were engaged in the early and critical part of a large amphibious operation. For the second time, it turned out I was wrong. Their attitude about risking their fleet had not changed. Their methods of operation had changed, in that they were using carriers again. They intended to use their fleet to exploit any advantages that their carrier air might gain. They had no intention of throwing everything at us by coming into Saipan at high speed to fight it out. With the information which we had of their most recent plans, all of which fitted well with what we know of their past operations, I felt it was necessary to remain with Task Force 58 in air-supporting distance of Saipan until we knew definitely the location of the major portion of the Japanese fleet. We could not afford to be drawn off to the westward by a diversion created by a portion of their fleet, while the remainder of it was enabled to go around one of our flanks and hit our transports and cargo ships at Saipan or in the areas eastward of Saipan. He noted how he had sent out 325-mile searches on June 18th at 0530 and 1330, then retired back at night to support Saipan. He noted the failure of the PBM report of that evening to reach him. He noted that next morning he was close enough to Guam and Rota to smash those fields and the planes that landed there, and recalled how they had chased the Japanese fleet. But by this time, Spruance's attention was focused on the difficult battle for the Marianas themselves. Almost from the beginning, the fighting on Saipan was desperate. In the first bombardment, on June 13th, the fast battleships had not scored at all well. Their crews had never completed training in bombardment procedures, because they had been fully occupied in learning the new techniques of seamanship in working with the fast carriers. The first day's work was pretty miserable. The second day, Spruance was better pleased with the bombardment by the experienced officers and men in the fire support groups of the old battleships and smaller ships, but any optimism was premature. All the way around, fighting on the bigger island was going to be a different matter from taking those atolls where the ground area could be measured in hundreds of acres. The Japanese believed they could defend the Marianas against American attack, and so spirits were even stouter there than on other islands. There was no easy time for the first waves here. The assault marines were fighting for their lives the moment they left the Amphtrax. The landings themselves were accomplished with more skill than before. The amphibious men learned every day. But on the first night, June 15th, the landing forces were far from their objective. They did not attain that first day's objective until the third day, June 17. Thus, when Jocko Clark and Mark Mitcher were only worrying about the Japanese fleet, Spruance, even though he had moved away from the beaches, was very much aware that the Saipan invasion was not going according to plan. The Army 27th Division had been held in reserve for Saipan, and it began moving in one June 16th and June 17th. There were anxious moments for Lieutenant General Holland Smith, particularly when Kelly Turner announced that in view of the impending fleet and air battle, he was taking the transport fleet and the supporting forces out to sea. There were anxious moments for Rear Admiral Harry Hill, when he found himself on the Cambria, with a handful of destroyers and a few transports and smaller craft, sitting at Saipan feeling all alone. There were 78,000 men ashore then, and everyone who knew what was happening was very nervous, even though the beachhead had been secured on June 17th. On June 19th, elements of the 27th Division pushed behind Aslito airfield to the east coast of Saipan. A Japanese plane landed on Aslito that day, its pilot unaware that the strip was in American hands. Things ashore were going well enough that on the morning of June 20th, Holland Smith formally took over control of the ground forces on Saipan from Kelly Turner. Next day, the Battle of the Philippine Sea at an end, Admiral Turner brought the transports and the support ships back to Saipan, and the tempo of the invasion stepped up. On June 22nd, Holland Smith moved the Army 27th Division in between the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions. He planned a broad sweep across the island, but while the two Marine Divisions moved ahead on schedule, the 27th did not, and by nightfall of June 23rd it had not moved satisfactorily at all, and instead of a straight line of troops across the island, there was a U, with the 27th in the depression of the U. That day, Holland Smith spoke to Major General Sanderford Jarman, who was to be island commander of Saipan once it was taken. Holland Smith persuaded Jarman to go up front and talk to Ralph Smith, who promised to move his troops along. But on June 24th, the troops of the 27th were still bogged down, and they were slowing the advance of the Marines on their left and right flanks. Holland Smith had little patience with the 27th Division by this time. He recalled their slowness at Markin and their ineffectuality at Engebe, which had caused Harry Hill to employ exhausted Marines to take Parry Island. On June 24th, Holland Smith took his battle maps and went aboard Kelly Turner's flagship Rocky Mount. He had prepared an official letter asking for Ralph Smith's relief. Kelly Turner was a hot-tempered man himself, but this matter was not one in which temper played a part. Holland Smith went into great detail about the operations from the time of landing. His account, wrote Turner, closely coincided with my impression of events, which I had carefully followed through troop reports and oral reports given by various staff officers. Turner indicated that Holland Smith had every right to relieve the other Smith if he wished, but both knew that since army troops were involved, there would be hell to pay between the services. Therefore they agreed to go over to the Indianapolis and talk it over with Spruance. Here is Captain Moore's recollection of that meeting. Admiral Turner and General Smith and Admiral Spruance and I sat around the table in the Indianapolis cabin for an hour or more, discussing this situation and what might be done about it. Holland Smith had told us that General Sanderford Jarman, who had been designated as the garrison command after Saipan had been captured, was available, and that General Jarman had indicated his disgust also with the performance of the 27th Division, and said that by gosh he could make them fight, and if they'd give him command of the division, he'd see that they did fight. This discussion bid fair to be rather endless, Moore observed, and he busied himself by drafting a dispatch to Holland Smith, authorizing and directing him to replace Ralph Smith. Thus, Spruance took full responsibility for the relief of Ralph Smith. Back at Pearl Harbor, the fat began to sputter in the fire. Richard Harler of International News Service came to McArdle. "When are you going to release the fact that Ralph Smith has been relieved as commander of the 27th Division?" McArdle replied that officially he knew nothing about the relief. Where had Haler heard the tale? "It's all over town," Harler said. "I heard it from one of the general's close friends." McArdle knew there was no point in trying to conceal the scandal, so he included a paragraph on the relief in the communiqué on which he was working, and then took it down to the office of the Chief of Staff. Admiral McMorris scanned the communiqué until he came to the reference to Ralph Smith. "No!" he shouted, and he scratched out the paragraph with a flourish. "It's all over Honolulu," said McArdle. "Who told 'em?" demanded McMorris fiercely, as though McArdle must have done it. 50,000 men on Saipan know it," said McArdle. "You can't keep a thing like that quiet." "The answer is no," said McMorris, and turned back to his papers. Like Jocko Clark, McArdle was not above defying Navy protocol when he thought he was right. He went to see Captain Austin, the new Assistant Chief of Staff who had replaced Preston Mercer as interlocutor between the public relations men and Admiral Nimitz, in view of McMorris's proclivities for a short, sharp answer. McArdle argued the public relations point of view, that it was senseless to try to sit on the scandal. Soon, he said, the story would break in the United States, and it would sound much worse than if the plain facts had been released. Austin agreed and took the matter up with Admiral Nimitz. He was gone perhaps 10 minutes, while McArdle waited in the office. "The answer is still no," Austin said when he returned. "The Admiral is going to say nothing of the incident. The War Department can make such announcement as it cares to. You see," he added, "the Admiral doesn't want to do anything to hurt Ralph Smith. But if Admiral Nimitz's silence in this matter helped Smith, it did nothing to help Army-Navy relations." A few days after the incident, the news of Ralph Smith's relief broke in Washington. But the implication of the stories was that Holland Smith was the butcher he had been declared to be after Tarawa, and that Ralph Smith was relieved because he refused to obey Holland Smith's orders, not wanting to send his men to almost certain slaughter. Another version, certainly less complimentary to the army than the truth, had it that some of Ralph Smith's soldiers had refused to move into action. Nor was the bad press the end of the affair. On July 12th, Lieutenant General Richardson, commander of Army forces in the Pacific, arrived in Saipan on a visit. He made a display of decorating members of the 27th Division, which was normal enough for a commander. But he did not check in with Spruance or with Kelly Turner, as protocol indicated he should. Spruance did not care for such protocol, and when Richardson's failure was brought to his attention, he quite ignored the fact. But Kelly Turner's quick temper was aroused. Turner had never been noted for his tenderness toward the army, particularly after General Marshall's complaints about him, and he chose to look upon Richardson's actions as a personal affront. On July 13th, Turner called Captain Moore over to the Rocky Mount, and when Moore got there, Turner announced that he was going to bawl out General Richardson for not reporting either to him or to Holland Smith when he got to Saipan. "For goodness sake, Kelly," said Moore, "this seems to me an awful thing to do. It may give you some satisfaction, but it isn't going to do a bit of good for the war or the force for you to raise that kind of an issue." "I'm going to do it anyhow," said Turner. Moore thought Turner had a hangover. Kelly Turner had a reputation as a two-fisted drinking man. Spruance said that when Turner was finished with an operation, there was always a period in which he took a lot of liquor after working hours. Next morning he was always sharp and cool again. As for Nimitz, he too knew of Turner's drinking habits, but his answer was that he never saw Turner when he was incapable of doing his duty or thinking straight. And as far as criticism went, Nimitz was wont to cock an eye, grin, and remind his questioner of Lincoln's remarks about Grant. Maybe someone would let Nimitz know what Kelly Turner's brand was, so he could feed it to some of his other admirals. In this particular case, hangover or not, Turner laced Richardson up and down for not checking it. Richardson was furious. He said he had been affronted and left the cabin. He then went to Spruance's flagship and reported on the incident. "Oh, well," said Spruance, trying to laugh it off. "That's just Kelly Turner. Nobody pays any attention to him." Obviously, this was not one of Turner's best moments. At about this time, also, on learning of the relief of Ralph Smith, Nimitz had asked Turner and Spruance some pointed questions by dispatch about the use of the forces that would take Guam. Turner had replied snappily, which one did not do to Nimitz under any conditions, and Nimitz informed Spruance that he considered Turner's reply insubordinate. That Nimitz's reaction demanded immediate attention, for as anyone in the command knew, It would take only one word from Nimitz to put Kelly Turner out of a job. The best way to anger Nimitz was through insubordination. He would be almost superhumanly patient with any human error, but he would not bear insubordination for a moment. Turner was quick to deny any intention of insubordination. Spruance came to Turner's aid. "I talked to Turner about his top-secret dispatch to you," said Spruance. "Turner is overly frank and emphatic at times, very decided in his opinions, sometimes impulsive, but I don't believe he ever has any intention of being insubordinate. In the present case, I feel sure he had not. I am sorry that it happened, and I have every expectation that such a thing will not occur in the future." Nimitz cooled off, as he usually did when reassured by people he trusted. In the middle of July, Nimitz had a chance to come to the Marianas and see for himself what was going on. King had come to Hawaii for an inspection, and Nimitz brought the commander-in-chief out to Saipan for a look. On the night of July 17th, all the brass in the Marianas assembled aboard the Indianapolis for dinner. Strategy and tactics were forgotten for the night, but the evening was memorable because of the presence of an infestation of great sluggish flies, nearly an inch long, swarming about the ship. Next day the fate of Captain Moore was again an issue. His friends suggested that Moore take a job with Admiral McCain as Chief of Staff, McCain being an aviator. But to Moore this job represented a come-down. He had been Chief of Staff to the commander of the Fifth Fleet. Now he was being asked to take the job of Chief of Staff to the commander of the task force, in other words, to step down one whole echelon of command. Actually, Moore should have been a rear admiral to hold the job he had, and need be only a captain to take the job he was offered. It was like saying to a professional Navy officer, "We don't like you, we will not promote you, but we need you, so come and let us rub your nose in the dirt." At least, that was how Captain Moore regarded the invitation. He turned it down in terms so plain that Spruance spent the evening shushing him up, lest King and Nimitz hear. From that moment on, for Moore, it was simply a matter of waiting to be detached and sent to other duty, the nature of which he would not know until he got his orders. Those orders sent him back to Washington in a staff job, where he served the remainder of the war. The battle for Saipan was officially over, having ended on July 10th when the flag was raised at Holland Smith's headquarters. On July 12th, Major General Harry Schmidt of the Marines relieved Holland Smith in command of the troops on the island. The mopping up continued for 3 weeks, during which time many Japanese soldiers, civilians, and Chamorros killed themselves, for this was the first thoroughly land the Americans had encountered. To Holland, Smith-Saipan was the decisive battle of the Pacific. His point of view is supported by events in Japan. On the day that the loss of Saipan was announced in Tokyo, the Tojo cabinet resigned. For the first time, the Americans had breached the inner limits of the empire. Tinian was to be taken next. Admiral Turner appointed Rear Admiral Harry Hill to command the Task Force 52 that would attack the island, and Marine General Harry Schmidt was chosen by Holland Smith to lead the ground forces. From June 14th, Tinian had been bombarded by fire support ships, and later by artillery of the Twirltor Army Corps from the southern shore of Saipan. The distance across the strait that separated the islands was 3 miles. Across that water, more than 30,000 rounds of ammunition were delivered in the course of the operation. Given the assignment of capturing Tinian, Harry Hill began to look over the plans. The Turner plan called for a landing at Tinian town, but Hill was positive that the Japanese were expecting them there, and he did not like it at all. Studying the aerial photographs, he was drawn to 2 little white beaches on the northwest shore of the island, handkerchief size as far as landings were concerned. Hill went ashore on Saipan then and looked up Schmidt for a talk. Schmidt called in his Chief of Staff, William Rogers, and his operations officer, Colonel Robert Hoggaboom, and General Erskine, the Chief of Staff to Holland Smith. They agreed that the white beaches were best for the purposes of surprise, if Hill could manage to put the troops in there effectively, and Hill believed he could. Hill then took his plan and the indications of marine backing and went aboard the Rocky Mount to discuss it with Turner. As Hill had half expected, Turner exploded. The answer was no. Hill could damned well stop that planning right that moment, and perfect the operations plans for the Tinian Town invasion, as ordered. Harry Hill went back to the Cambria a very unhappy admiral, which was unusual for him. He was gay and smiling as a rule, free with his staff and popular with his men. Life aboard the Cambria tended to be light-hearted when there was no desperate work to be done, for Hill was the exact opposite of his senior admiral. He was the leader who inspired rather than the driver who manipulated. His officers all had nicknames and broke themselves up in the wardroom at dinner, recalling their own didos in operations past. How Squeaky Anderson, the beachmaster, had done this or that, and even the admiral's actions were not above examination. But this day there was no levity aboard the Cambria, for Harry Hill was making a vital decision. In the end he stuck with what he knew to be right, and prepared to lay his career on the line. Turner had ordered him flatly to stop planning for the White Beaches. Instead, Hill split his staff in two, half working on the White Beaches plan, half working on the Tinian Town plan. J-Day, the day to go in, was set for July 12th by Turner. It would be July 24th. On July 24th, Hill went back to Admiral Turner, who refused to listen to any talk about the White Beaches. Then Hill swallowed hard and began his desperate foray. He took his plan for the White Beaches to Holland Smith. Smith liked it. With that backing, Hill took the plan over Turner's head to Admiral Spruance. The senior admiral said he approved. Then Spruance said he would call a meeting to settle the matter, and Hill agreed. They met aboard the Indianapolis. Major General Schmidt, Major General Watson of the 2nd Marines, Major General Clifton Cates of the 4th Marines, Vice Admiral Kelly Turner, and Rear Admiral Hill, all sitting around Spruance's conference table. Hill laid out his plan. They discussed it as he looked sidelong at Kelly Turner. Then Spruance called for votes. Admiral Hill breathed a long sigh of relief, but he was not out of the woods yet. Having forced the issue with Turner, it was imperative that the plan succeed, said Hill. He went back to the Cambria and redoubled his efforts to make sure there were no holes in the White Beaches plan. A few days before the scheduled invasion, Commander Louis W. Mang came to see Hill. Mang was an academy graduate, and his father was a friend of Hill's from the distant days when Hill had been teaching at the academy. In 1944, Mang was an aviator sent out from the States to field test a new device, the napalm bomb. He showed Admiral Hill how airplane wing tanks could be converted into firebombs by filling them with napalm and fusing them. Hill was intrigued. In the battle for Saipan, the Japanese had contested each yard of territory more ferociously than ever before. One reason Hill wanted to move into the White Beaches in the northwest rather than the broad beaches of the south at Tinian Town. Surprise was a weapon of value. So, it seemed, could be this new napalm. The idea of fire was not new. The Marines were using fire from flamethrowers to burn Japanese soldiers in their caves and blockhouses, but the use that Mang outlined was staggering in its potential. Admiral Hill ordered 8,500 pounds of napalm from Pearl Harbor by airplane, and the imperturbable men of the service force accepted this recondite demand and fulfilled it without a hitch. Commander Mang began building his bombs at Aslito airfield. When the first bombs were ready, Hill brought Spruance, Turner, and the Marine generals aboard a destroyer and took them down near Tinian Town for an exhibition. Mang hooked his bombs to a P-51 fighter, and the plane took off, the pilot instructed to come in low and fast and skip-bomb his target, which was on a piece of flat land near the shore. The run was made, the improvised bomb was dropped, and the field that was the target suddenly erupted in flame as though a gunpowder fuse were being lighted, except that instead of flaming up and going out, the napalm burned and burned and burned. From the flagship, Hill measured the strip burned by the one bomb. It was 100 yards long and 30 yards wide. Having convinced the Japanese even more firmly by such activity that Tinian Town was the target, Hill continued to plan for the Little Beaches. On July 17th, the plan was issued. It included the use of portable ramps and floating gas stations, ideas that had been wild dreams a few months earlier. Meanwhile, on July 21st, Rear Admiral Richard Connolly made the long-delayed landing on Guam, marked by the longest sustained bombardment of the war to date, 13 days, conducted with great skill by Admiral Connolly. It was the most effective naval bombardment of the war too, knocking out nearly every emplacement that was not either buried or mobile. Marine Major General R.S. Geiger was in charge of the troops, and he comported himself brilliantly in the field against very heavy Japanese opposition. The Marianas represented full-scale fighting. The Japanese staged tank counterattacks and fought with big guns all the way. By the end of the fighting, the Americans had put 54,000 men in the field, to account for 19,000 Japanese. General Geiger said that organized resistance ended on August 10th, but resistance never did end. 8,500 of those Japanese were killed or captured after August 10th, and even at the time of the Japanese surrender in 1945, a lieutenant colonel and 113 officers and men were still at large on the island. On J1 or July 23rd, Admiral Hill divided Tinian into 5 sectors for bombardment purposes. Very heavy attention was given to Tinian town to persuade the Japanese that the Americans were indeed coming into those heavily mined and fortified beaches. A single cruiser worked over the White Beach area, but the battleship Colorado banged away at Phoebus San Hilo Point, destroying a battery of 3 140 mm guns, which could have played hob with the landing next day. After all, the White Beaches were so narrow that not more than 8 landing craft could land abreast. Hill sent minesweepers in to comb the area around Tinian town, again to increase the illusion that this would be the landing place. Next morning, the troops began to land. Transports carrying the 2nd Marine Division moved off the beaches of Tinian town, and the Marines climbed down into landing craft, which sped in toward shore at 0730 hours. The Japanese opened fire with mortars, and a mile off the beach the landing craft reversed and went back to the transports. The landing had failed. Indeed it had, just as this fake landing was supposed to fail, further leading the Japanese to believe Tinian town was the target, and to persuade Admiral Kakuta and Colonel Kiyoshi Ogata to concentrate the island's 9,000 defenders in that area. The Japanese were further exhilarated by their own good artillery shooting. Their coastal guns here scored 6 hits on destroyer Norman Scott and 22 hits on the Colorado, killing some 60 men, including the captain of the destroyer, and wounding nearly 150 more. Meanwhile, the real landings were beginning on the White Beaches to the northwest, the first wave of Amphtrax hitting the beach at 0750 and 14 waves following on their heels. 2 Amphtrax were knocked out by mines on White 2, but the landings were comparatively easy. Only 15 officers and men were killed on both beaches. 2 unhurt pillboxes caused some trouble on White 2, and so did some more mines, but the Marines kept coming in and moving on. That evening the portable ramps began to go into place, and next morning loaded trucks could roll directly out of LSTs onto the land. By the close of J-Day, 15,614 Marines, soldiers and sailors were ashore. It was the beginning of what Admiral Spruance called the most brilliantly conceived and executed amphibious operation of the war. On J+1, the Japanese staged a strong counterattack, but it failed. On J+4, the first planes landed on the airstrip. On J+8, Tinian was secured. The cost was 389 Americans killed and 1,816 wounded, against more than 5,000 Japanese killed and a handful taken prisoner. Even these figures, as always, represented only the American count. There had been 9,000 defenders. What happened to the other 4,000 Japanese? Some escaped, but most must have committed suicide deep in the caves where they were hidden. At the end, as the Japanese and their supporters were driven to the high ground that overlooked the sea in the southern part of the island, Harry Hill watched a drama that had been played also on Saipan and on Guam. The Japanese were trying to effect a mass suicide. The Americans brought up a public address system on a jeep to talk to the crowd on the plateau 200 feet above the sea, a crowd of Japanese soldiers and thousands of civilian men, women and children. Japanese language officers spoke to them, asking them to give up. They would not be hurt. The Japanese answer came when a dozen soldiers threw themselves over the cliff into the sea. The Japanese language officers spoke again. A Japanese blew himself up with a grenade. Another grenade went off in a crowd of soldiers and civilians, and it seemed to set off some kind of bomb, for dozens of arms, legs, and torsos were suddenly cascaded bloodily into the air. Then the civilians ran for the American line to surrender. The remainder of the Japanese soldiers fled to caves or to leap over the cliff, and the affair was over. Almost anywhere one looked in the summer of 1944, there was furious activity. Admiral Clark concocted and conducted a brilliant raid on the volcano islands, Iwo and Chichijima, netting scores of planes and a whole convoy of ships before he was finished. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral William Halsey was organizing his Third Fleet, which would employ the same ships and planes as the Fifth Fleet. The difference would be that Halsey and his staff would take out the Third Fleet, with Vice Admiral McCain as commander of the Fast Carrier Task Force, which would, under him, be known as Task Force 38. Meanwhile, Spruance would come ashore to plan with his staff for his next operation, and Admiral Mitcher would also leave the fleet with Spruance. The plan was to alternate the commands, thus using the same ships for tasks that followed each other like clockwork. On June 15th, Halsey was detached officially from the South Pacific, and Vice Admiral Newton took over. 3 days later, Halsey was ensconced in offices in the new JICPOA building, Joint Intelligence Center Pacific Ocean Areas, planning for the occupation of the Western Caroline Islands. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were still talking about the route to Tokyo. Admiral King was committed to the idea of bypassing the Philippines and mounting the next major offensive against Formosa. He ordered Nimitz to draw up such a plan, and reluctantly Nimitz put Forrest Sherman to work on it. Sherman drew up the plan, but he hated it. He said he hoped he had drawn such a bad plan that it would be thrown out, because he believed that to move against Formosa without first taking at least Luzon in the Philippines, with all its available airfields and supplies, would be to court annihilation in Formosa with attacks from 2 fronts. But what to do? Everybody seemed to have a different idea. Nimitz wanted to take the Western Carolines first, then invade the central Philippines and Iwo Jima. Halsey wanted to bypass the Carolines, then take the central Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and Japan. Spruance wanted to go to the Carolines, but not Yap, and then to Nimrod Sound, south of Shanghai. Kelly Turner talked of going directly to Japan with a huge amphibious force. MacArthur, of course, was steadfast in his plan, to move to Luzon, take the Philippines, reconquer the Netherlands, East Indies, and roll up the Japanese Empire from the south. Admiral King was as firm for his plan as MacArthur was for his, and Nimitz, as a loyal commander, was in the position of having to support the King plan whether he agreed with it or not. This point was made very clear in King's letter of February 8, 1944, to Nimitz, in which King berated the Pacific and South Pacific commanders and staff for not uniformly supporting his idea of bypassing the Philippines. The result of the pulling and hauling was that in the summer of 1944, President Franklin Roosevelt decided to make a trip to the Pacific and settle the question for himself. It was an election year, to be sure, and there were people who considered Roosevelt's trip a grandstand play. But the fact of the very basic disagreement among many strategists could not be denied. The visit was well planned. Secret Service agents came in advance and okayed the mansion on Diamond Head made available to the president. Nimitz sent a message inviting General MacArthur to come to Hawaii. MacArthur replied that he was too busy. King asked MacArthur to come. MacArthur was still too busy. General Marshall then ordered MacArthur to come, and he set out with 5 members of his staff. King came to Pearl Harbor just before the president arrived, but since he was definitely not invited to this meeting, King hurriedly left for the Central Pacific on an inspection tour. MacArthur arrived by plane on July 26th, a few minutes before the president's ship, the cruiser Baltimore, came into harbor. Nimitz had asked MacArthur to stay with him in the house on Makalapa, but the messages had somehow been garbled, and MacArthur ended up believing he had only an invitation from General Richardson, which he accepted. In the meetings that were to follow, Roosevelt apparently intended to discover for himself just what his field commanders planned. They sat in a big room filled with maps of the Pacific, and Nimitz took up a pointer and stepped to the map to present the Navy plan, to bypass the Philippines and attack Formosa. MacArthur, feeling that he would be confined to a backwater command if this plan was followed, then presented his old Reno plan. It was a most forceful presentation, since he knew the plan very well and had for some time. When the meetings were over, no one was quite certain what President Roosevelt was thinking about the future. Several decisions were made. The president did favor MacArthur's march into the Philippines for emotional and high political reasons. MacArthur and Nimitz agreed on one vital aspect of the coming campaigns. MacArthur must have fleet and logistical support from the Pacific Fleet in future operations. At a special meeting of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in August, Admiral Leahy outlined the discussions at Pearl Harbor. We had a special meeting of the Joint Chiefs in which I gave them a detailed report of the Honolulu conferences. They may have been somewhat surprised to learn that Nimitz and MacArthur said they had no disagreements at the moment, and they could work out their joint plans in harmony. But, and it was a very big but, the final decision on Pacific operations, especially in the matter of an assault on Japan itself, would have to be made by the Commander-in-Chief. Commander-in-Chief in this sense meant the President, not King, as Commander-in-Chief of the Navy. In fact, there was a basic change of emphasis this summer. Although the President had always previously been accompanied on trips abroad by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he had chosen to go to Pearl Harbor with only Leahy, his aide Wilson Brown, and his military aide General Watson. A bit earlier, Leahy had suggested that Admiral King stop using the term Commander-in-Chief, because Roosevelt, who was by definition Commander-in-Chief of all the armed forces, wanted to use that designation. Some writers have since said that the impulse was political, in view of the 1944 presidential campaign. In any event, Admiral King resisted the idea, demanding an outright order to stop using the title, and nothing more was ever heard of it. The presidential visit brought some new problems to Pearl Harbor to make Nimitz's head spin. Roosevelt announced that he was coming to the Macalapa House for lunch the second day. The Secret Service men rushed up to the house and ordered it virtually rebuilt. Doors were to be rehung, bathrooms rebuilt, and even a roadway put behind the house because Roosevelt was sensitive about anyone seeing him get into and out of cars. On the day of the luncheon, 500 men of a CB battalion came to the Admiral's house and began taking it apart. They repainted what was necessary and dried the paint with blowtorches. At noon they were gone, and no one would have known they had even been there, as Roosevelt sat down to drink a couple of martinis and eat a luncheon of mahi-mahi, the Hawaiian fish. Lamar, Nimitz's aide, said he counted 136 stars on the collars of the general and flag officers at that lunch that day. The Navy's strategic plan for 1944 seemed still to be in effect, although nobody was really certain of what had happened. MacArthur went back to the South, feeling that he had won his battle. He feels that he has the President's and Admiral Leahy's assurances that Luzon will not be bypassed. Artemus Gates wrote James Forrestal, who had become Secretary of the Navy upon Knox's death. But 2 months after the meetings in Hawaii, MacArthur was still not certain that he had won. That was Franklin Roosevelt's way. Nimitz was extremely busy with new problems. Sparked by Admiral Radford's suggestions, the Navy was planning for a night-operating carrier division. Planes from a night-operating carrier might very well have discovered the Japanese fleet in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The development of the planes and the techniques was an indication of the rapid movement of the naval science of carrier operation. At the end of July, Admiral Pownall left Pearl Harbor, bound for Pensacola and a shore job. He went to see Nimitz before he left, trying to find a place for himself in the Pacific, but there was no room. The younger fighting admirals of the carrier forces had taken over. On August 8th, Nimitz was off to Guam for a tour, accompanied by General Vandergrift, who had come out from Washington, and Forrest Sherman. One reason for the tour was to look over the terrain and harbours, and the possible use of Guam as an advanced fleet headquarters. Nimitz found the build-up of his staff and everything else at Pearl Harbor very trying. So many hundreds of officers had joined his staff that he could not possibly know them all well, as he had known the original group back in 1942. The change was inevitable, with the growth of the fleet and the vigorous prosecution of the war. Its proportions can be indicated by the fact that not only was there a complete logistics section of the staff, headed by a rear admiral, but there was an assistant chief of staff for logistics, who in turn, unhappily and unnecessarily, had his own executive assistant, a planning section, a transportation section, a construction section, an ordnance section, an administrative section, and a statistical section. By this time, an absolutely vital element in the invasion plans was the service force of Vice Admiral Calhoun. Everything the Americans used had to be brought with them, and the responsibility for sorting it out and bringing it was Calhoun's. This meant the finding and use of provision ships, tankers, ammunition ships, and a dozen other types. The big natural base at Eniwetok was used fully as a staging area, and millions of tons of supplies would pass through there. In the Marianas operation alone, for example, nearly 200 supply ships were to be employed by the forces of Admiral Spruance. One of the major reasons for the Marianas move was to create a staging area for development of stockpiles within 1,000 miles of the scene of the coming 1945 operations. The service squadrons remain largely unsung in the history of the war, like the Quartermaster Corps of the Army, but without them the Navy could never have moved in the conquest of the Pacific. Nimitz, of course, had his own reason for wanting to go to Guam, besides the huge pile-up of administrative detail. He wanted to be much closer to the scene of operations. In conferences at Pearl Harbor that summer, King had squelched the idea of movement into the Philippines. He did not want to hear any more about the Philippines, he told Nimitz when he visited Pearl just before Roosevelt came, until Nimitz and his people had surveyed the possibility of using Eniwetok and Guam as bases for moving directly to Formosa. As Halsey moved out in August to take command of the Third Fleet and of the operation against the Western Carolines, the future was still not settled. But it was soon to be settled, and on September 9th, Halsey had copies of orders for the invasion of the Philippines. Halsey went to sea to rendezvous with Mark Mitcher's task force, because McCain was still ashore at Pearl Harbor trying to assemble a staff. Admiral Towers was trying to help him. Towers, at this time, was being pushed into the background in the operations out of Pearl, although as Nimitz's deputy he had expected to exert more influence than he had had before as commander of the Air Force. Towers put the blame for this state of affairs on Forrest Sherman, whom he had brought to the command in the first place. New pressures were put on Nimitz. Secretary Forrestal was not at all happy with Navy public relations. The public has only a very inadequate and hazy impression of what the Navy has done in this war, he wrote Nimitz. The failure was the Navy's own inadequacy in public relations. Part of this stems from the nature of Army and Navy training, but not all of it, he said. He also said of the Army commanders, with obvious reference to Eisenhower and MacArthur, they are all pretty good dialecticians. Nimitz, who had recently experienced in the MacArthur-Roosevelt visit an exposure to that dialectic expertise, had very little to say. Nor would it have done him much good to argue, for Forrestal had long felt strongly about the deficiencies of the Navy's public relations, and was determined to make some basic changes. In the Guam operation, as an example of this change, Nimitz had visited the island at the end of the campaign and held a press conference with General Geiger. It was a friendly affair. Geiger had recently liberated a number of cases of Suntory whiskey, a Japanese product that tasted almost exactly like Scotch. Robert Trumbull of the New York Times, formerly of the Honolulu Star-Bulletin, asked with a twinkle what the general had there. "Don't you think, General," said Nimitz with a grin that proved there was nothing wrong with his public relations, "we could make one case available to the press?" One case was made available, and the correspondents lugged it over to the tent, where they quaffed and wrote their stories. Admiral Nimitz's plane was to leave for Pearl Harbor the following morning, and Lamar agreed to take the press copy back to Pearl and give it to Captain Drake for dispatch. Departure was to be at 0700 sharp. Next morning, however, the plane took off about 0600, and McArdle, the public relations man there, did not even have the copy yet. He put it on the next plane to Pearl, which should have arrived the following day, but it did not. Nimitz reached Pearl Harbor, and the Pearl Harbor commandos came over for a press conference. They got the stories, they were filed, and when the stories of the combat correspondents in the field came in, they were suitable for nothing but the wastebasket. In the forward areas, there was also considerable public relations friction. The Army Air Forces, and particularly the 7th Air Force, under General Hale, were having their difficulties with the Navy. Admiral Hoover claimed that Hale's boys bombed from too far up and exaggerated their victories. Hoover did not care for their performance at all. Furthermore, he objected to Hale's methods of garnering publicity. McArdle was assigned to Hoover's command at the end of the Marianas operation, and Hoover instructed his new public relations officer. "I don't care about publicity myself," he said. "There are certain people who have had publicity all out of proportion to their achievements. As long as I am in command here, I want to see to it that credit is fairly distributed. I want you to censor all press material originating in this area, and I want to see every line that is written about General Hale." One of the basic causes of friction in that combined command was opposite attitudes toward publicity. The Air Force made sure that its activities were known in every corner of the United States, and it accomplished this aim by sending out thousands and thousands of personal stories to hometown papers. The Navy was far behind. That message was being pounded home in the Navy Department in Washington. Particularly with the expansion of the operations, the correspondents were becoming restless. They did not like the uncertain transportation, the muddled censorship, because there were not enough censors, and the poor communications. In August, Nimitz noted that Captain H.B. Miller was going to come out to Pearl to look over the photographic situation. Miller was an airman, and also a graduate of the Naval Academy of the class of 1924, a former assistant naval attaché in London, and director of training literature for the Bureau of Aeronautics. He arrived in Pearl Harbor just as the Western Carolines operation began, and he took over public relations. Captain Drake was out on the Palau invasion. Captain Miller moved into Captain Drake's office and moved Lieutenant Commander Alan Bosworth out into the anteroom from behind Waldo Drake's desk. When Drake heard of the change, at Saipan, he took off for Pearl Harbor. He found that his desk had indeed been usurped. He moved a new desk in, alongside Captain Miller's. Captain Miller ordered the desk moved out, and Captain Drake ordered it moved back in again. Then the Cold War began. If someone called for the public relations officer and Captain Drake answered the phone, he would say, "I am the public relations officer." If someone called for the public relations officer and Captain Miller answered the phone, he would say, "Speaking." And so it went, with the callers growing ever more confused. Captain Drake conferred with Admiral Nimitz, who told him that he, Nimitz, considered Drake the public relations officer, but that Secretary Forrestal, who was in charge, considered that Captain Miller held that title. Whereupon Captain Drake went back to Washington to straighten out affairs, and was never again seen at Pearl Harbor. Forrestal shanghaied him, kept him in Washington, and was soon talking of sending him over to the Office of War Information, where they had been asking for someone who knew something about the Pacific. Captain Miller began moving out the old public relations team and moving in a new one, which would eventually number several hundred officers and men. In spite of such monumental struggles at headquarters, the war continued. The operation from which Captain Drake had come back was the successful invasion of the Palaus, 530 miles from the southern Philippines, halfway from Guam to Mindanao. Vice Admiral McCain was scheduled to be Mitch's replacement, but he needed some experience in new carrier techniques, so in the summer's operations McCain was given Clark's task group, now called Task Group 38.1. The lineup was changed considerably at this point. Reeves, Clark, Harrell and Montgomery were all given a rest, and Rear Admiral G.F. Bogan took Reeves's force, Rear Admiral Frederick C. Sherman took Montgomery's force, and Rear Admiral Ralph E. Davison took Harrell's. The force was also changed a bit. 2 more carriers were added, for a total of 17. On August 28th, Halsey sailed from Eniwetok, the big advance fleet base. Incidentally, and rather more than that as far as the war is concerned, the task forces had been out-raiding ever since the capture of the Marianas was assured, and their presence was no longer needed offshore. Halsey went out full of fire and brimstone to hit Yap, the Palaus, and Mindanao. He found that the Japanese air power was so slight as to scarcely constitute a challenge. The task force roamed where it would and bombed and strafed at will. On September 12 and 13, the force flew off 2,400 sorties, knocking out an estimated 200 planes, sinking ships from merchantmen to sampans, and blowing up buildings. The opposition was so slight that on September 13th, Halsey suggested that the landings at Morotai, the Palay, and Mindanao be cancelled as not needed to soften up the Philippines, which was their purpose. It was too late to stop Morotai and the Palaus. The invasion forces were already underway. General MacArthur's landing on Morotai was a direct result of the July conference at Pearl Harbor. It was to be a stepping-off place for the assault on Mindanao that MacArthur proposed to make. Rear Admiral Daniel E. Barbey was the amphibious commander, working under Vice Admiral Kincaid's 7th Fleet. Rear Admiral William M. Fechteler handled part of the invasion. Rear Admiral R.S. Berkey commanded the support group, which consisted of 5 American and Australian cruisers and 10 American and Australian destroyers. Rear Admiral Thomas L. Sprague had 6 escort carriers for air support, and Nimitz lent McCain's Task Group 38.1 to MacArthur for D-Day operations. Some 28,000 troops under Major General Charles P. Hall of the Nixon Corps were landed. There were difficulties in landing, but they were caused by insufficient knowledge of the beaches. As far as Japanese resistance was concerned, it was a walkaway. At the end of 2 weeks, only a few Japanese had been killed or captured by the land forces.